It's been over a year and a half since I quit my job as a hospital social worker because of burnout. And to this day, that job still haunts me. Whenever I drive by the highway exit I used to take to get to work, I start getting this visceral reaction. Like my insides start doing this. Whenever I hear my friends that I kept in touch with from that job talk about work, I feel that exact same, very specific anger and frustration that I only felt at that job just start bubbling up again. About a month ago, I got a piece of mail from my old workplace and my stomach dropped seeing that envelope, even though the mail ended up being something positive. After I got that piece of mail, I started thinking, how am I still having these reactions over a year and a half later? Shouldn't I have healed from my burnout by now? Shouldn't I be over it by now? And so, as one does whenever one has a seemingly unanswerable life question, I consulted Google and I came across the term workplace trauma. And that's when I realized, oh, it wasn't just burnout I was going through, I was actually traumatized. I kind of joked about having PTSD from this job, but as I read these articles on workplace trauma and read other people's stories sharing their experiences that were very similar to mine, that's when I realized maybe PTSD wasn't an over-exaggeration. It's funny how even though I'm a therapist and I have extensive knowledge about trauma, when it comes to myself, it's so easy to miss the signs. Honestly, it was really validating to learn that workplace trauma is a real thing. It's not an over-exaggeration and a lot of other people have gone through it. And it's not just the professions that first come to mind when we think of PTSD, like the military, first responders, healthcare workers. Anyone in any job can go through workplace trauma. Also, based on my very scientifically rigorous polls on Instagram and YouTube community, clearly the vast majority of you have experienced workplace trauma too. And so I wanted to make a video to shed some light on the topic and share my experience in case it helps any of you in the way that hearing other people's experiences have helped me. I'm also going to be sharing some of the things that I've been doing to heal. Now, I am a therapist, but I'm not presenting this in a prescriptive, this is how you heal workplace trauma kind of way, because I clearly still haven't figured it out. I'm still on that journey, but if me sharing the things I've been doing to heal brings you some healing as well, then I will have accomplished my goal with this video. Let's start with the definition, shall we? Trauma results from exposure to an incident or series of events that are emotionally disturbing or life-threatening, with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and well-being. Trauma is a psychological injury where your sense of safety is threatened, and workplace trauma is simply when we experience these injuries at work. It could be one big injury, like you actually get physically injured, or you experience an incident of violence, or you witness something traumatic. Or maybe you got the rug pulled from underneath you and you got laid off with no warning. I was in that boat in 2020, and chances are some of you were too. Or you saw someone you worked closely with get laid off, or maybe you watched your company do a mass layoff. And this was jarring because it made you realize that your seemingly secure job is pretty insecure after all, and now you're wondering when it's going to be your turn on the chopping block next. Job insecurity is a major threat to your financial life, which in turn is a major threat to your safety and survival. These single incident injuries are the more obvious, the more visible causes of workplace trauma, but they are not actually the most common cause. You would think that working in a hospital and dealing with death and serious illness and injury and grief and loss on a daily basis, that it would be the vicarious trauma of witnessing all these horrible things all the time that would be the cause of my workplace trauma, but it's not. It wasn't even dealing with the verbal abuse from patients and families when they were at their worst. The cause of my workplace trauma is probably the same as yours because it is the most common cause, yet it is more hidden, more insidious. It's working in a toxic work environment. According to this MIT Sloan Business Review article, a toxic workplace was the #1 driver of the Great Resignation. And I don't think this comes as a surprise to a lot of us. Likely many of us have personal experience with how those continual small injuries that this type of environment inflicts on you on a daily basis really add up and chip away at you over time to the point where your job just doesn't make you feel safe. This other MIT Sloan Business article lists the top 5 most toxic attributes of a workplace. They call them the Toxic 5, and they are disrespectful, non-inclusive, unethical, cutthroat, and abusive. In reflecting on my experience and in talking to friends who have also worked in unhealthy work environments, I found that pretty much all of these Toxic 5 can be found in 4 things at work: your boss, your colleagues, your workload and expectations, and the level of support you're given at work. So let's go through all of them together, and let's start with your boss. Without giving too much detail, let's just say that we had a boss who would have been a prime case study for the phrase, "People don't quit bad jobs, they quit bad bosses." Many people left while she was there, including me. Some of you might have heard of Nurse John. He is one of my favorite creators. He's just the best. But he has a podcast where he gets other healthcare workers to send in their craziest work stories, and then he reads them out loud. And I just find it so interesting to hear that other healthcare workers' worst work stories are also related to bad management and not actually the work itself. It seems like having a boss who is a bully is not an uncommon experience. I've even had friends who told me that they had a boss who yelled in the office, which I just think is so unprofessional. But anyways, friends have also told me about bosses they had who micromanaged or controlled them, and this just always made them feel on edge, having someone constantly looking over their shoulder, scrutinizing everything they were doing. I also read stories about bosses who were emotionally abusive. They were shaming, punitive, they made belittling, degrading comments, and maybe they even had a tendency to gaslight and deny your experience and make you question yourself. In a previous workplace, I had a boss who had a tendency to dismiss any new input or ideas from me or anyone who wasn't in a management role. And over time, this just makes you feel disrespected, not valued, and like what you have to say doesn't matter. All of this type of mistreatment doesn't just come from bosses, it could also come from colleagues. A lot of us probably also have stories of being backstabbed or thrown under the bus or just bullied by colleagues. Working in a hospital kind of felt like being in a high school sometimes. There were cliques, the cliques sat together at lunch in the cafeteria, and there was a very clear social hierarchy, and I really felt that social hierarchy moving from a student to an official social worker. As a student, you are a nobody. You are the bottom of the food chain. No one gives you any kind of regard, and I was excluded from everyone else, and this really brought back bad memories from elementary and middle school. And then after I graduated and I became an official social worker, people actually started to acknowledge my existence and treat me with basic decency and respect. And it made me realize that people will treat you differently based on your education level. And that's just pretty sad, if you ask me. I always made sure to be really nice to the students when I started working because I know how hard it is. Another core trait of hospital culture is gossip. Gossip traveled like wildfire. And when you hear colleagues gossip and shit talk their other colleagues behind their back on a daily basis, it does make you wonder what lies and rumors other people might be spreading about you too. Now, when it comes to workload, it's common knowledge that healthcare workers are overworked due to chronic understaffing and an overflowing healthcare system. And on the vast majority of days, the amount of work was unrealistic for one person to handle, and working through your lunch and having very little downtime and staying late were just the norm. There was also this unspoken social norm that not going above and beyond was frowned upon. And because I didn't want to be frowned upon, I really pushed myself and I paid the price. This normalization of overworking is definitely not just limited to healthcare. It exists across the board, and it's even worse in some other industries. Now, let's talk to the level of support at work. Being subjected to mistreatment and having an unrealistic workload already takes enough of a toll. It's even worse when there's really nowhere to turn for help at work. One of the hallmarks of trauma is feeling a loss of a sense of control or autonomy and feeling helpless and powerless in your situation. I certainly could not trust my superiors to go to them for support if I had an issue, even though they are the people you're supposed to go to. I knew they wouldn't help me. HR is not there for their employees, and there was very little resources for supporting employee well-being. For a while, it did feel like I was stuck in this unsupportive, harmful work environment because it was my only source of income and I needed it to subsist. And it did feel pretty helpless. I felt like I had no choice but to just shut up and take it. And I have a feeling that a lot of us can relate to that experience. I've also heard stories where people actually did speak up and their company did nothing. And that inaction cuts in a different way. There is a term coined by a psychologist, Jennifer Freed, called institutional betrayal, when an institution you trust or depend upon mistreats you. And I think it's sad to think that this is such a common experience that a whole new term had to be invented to describe it. Now, while no one likes to go through any of these things that we just talked about, some people might be more affected by them than others. And you might find that you'll have two people in the same position in the same toxic workplace, and one person is traumatized by it and the other person isn't. So let's talk about why that happens and what makes someone more susceptible to workplace trauma. If you have experienced any trauma in the past, you will have more triggers for trauma in the workplace. So as a personal example, because I was excluded and bullied in school, I will be much more likely to be triggered by being excluded and bullied in the workplace. And now I'm not saying this to make anyone feel bad for me or anything. I am simply providing this as an example, and maybe some of you guys can also relate to it. Similarly, if you had an abusive parent, you are going to be much more likely to be triggered by an abusive boss or colleague. Now, this video would not be complete if we didn't talk about trauma from discrimination at work. This Business Insider article talks about how people who experience trauma in the workplace are often members of marginalized groups, including women, underrepresented minorities, and those who identify as LGBTQ. Trauma can exacerbate the systemic biases these employees already face. I'm sure my fellow women of color out there know what it's like to experience harassment of all kinds and microaggressions and maybe even full-on aggression for things about our identity that we can't change. The systemic issues that make up our society also make up our workplaces, so some of us are going to be much more susceptible than our white, male, cis, straight counterparts. Let's talk about some of the signs and symptoms of workplace trauma. Hypervigilance is another hallmark of trauma. This is when you live in a constant state of anticipating or looking out for danger. When you're in this state of heightened alertness, you might even see danger where there is none. And things like the sound of your phone ringing or the notification sound on Slack or Teams might give you a jump scare, even though the message is likely harmless. You might even carry that hypervigilance with you after you leave your job. Clearly, I still am carrying some of it with me if a piece of mail makes me have a reaction that is just so out of proportion to the situation. Living in this state of hypervigilance is also just exhausting. Intrusive thoughts are also a sign. I found myself ruminating a lot about distressing work situations outside of work hours. I also used to have dreams about work, which were just the worst. Some people might even have flashbacks. Basically, any way that we might be reliving the traumatic moment in the present moment is a sign of trauma. Damaged self-esteem. I almost failed my student practicum for my master's. My preceptors and I were having a lot of difficulties, and that led me to graduating from my master's with zero confidence in myself as a social worker. Looking back now, I can definitely see that the difficulties between my preceptors and I were because of a difference in expectations. I was there expecting to learn from them, and they were there expecting me to help them lighten their workload. And so whenever I asked them a question, they didn't like it. I sensed that they were annoyed and that they felt bothered and that they were thinking like, why are you even asking this question? How do you not know that already? already? And I'm like, because I've only been here for 3 days and I'm just trying to learn. And so I eventually stopped asking them questions and I just taught myself. And I also really relied on one of my very close friends at the time who was already working as a social worker at a different hospital. She was like appalled by the way that my preceptors were treating me. And she was basically just like, if you're ever at practicum and you have a question, just call me when I'm at work. And so I did. But then my preceptors started interpreting me not asking questions as me not caring or not being motivated or not trying hard enough. And this was the feedback that they gave me at my midterm review. And honestly, it was so defeating to hear. I felt so judged and so lost as to how to navigate their expectations of me. I also started blaming myself. Like, am I the problem? Is there something wrong with me that they're reacting to me this way and that I can't meet their expectation of knowing everything in 3 days? I also started doubting myself. Like, am I taking this too personally or am I making too much of this? I really had to advocate for myself to pass, and I came out of that experience feeling so dejected and like there was no hope for me. Like, I actually felt like my career was over before it even started. It took a while for me to build my confidence back up, and I will share how I did that in the next part of the video, but for now, it is important to be aware that when you are mistreated by someone that you work under for a prolonged period of time, it can make you lose confidence in yourself, and it can cause a lot of self-doubt and self-blame. Changes in your worldview. I became like a doom and gloom girl. I definitely noticed myself getting really dark and cynical and thinking like, what's the point of all this? This is meaningless, etc., etc. Being checked out or emotionally numb. I found this video that could not more accurately describe what it's like to be a checked out healthcare worker.
Code red. A patient has started a fire in the emergency department. Attention. There is now a loose petting tiger in the pediatric unit. Notice, we are offering free flu vaccines on the 3rd floor. Please step around the flames. Attention, a geriatric patient has just summoned a demon. We are now looking for a human sacrifice.
Honestly, if I allowed myself to feel the full extent of my shock and frustration and sadness, I would not have been able to function normally. And so I really have to give credit to my adaptation method of checking out for getting me through. Checking out is not a good thing though, just to be clear. Engaging in avoidance behaviors more frequently. So this would be anything to suppress or numb our emotions and do a bit of escapism. This could be in the form of substances, food, doom scrolling, binging Netflix, like, I mean, pick your vice. For me, it was napping. Anxiety, depression, panic attacks, and all those fun things. Exhaustion, sleep issues, difficulty relaxing and feeling on edge all the time. Irritability, having more angry outbursts. I became a nightmare. Difficulty focusing and concentrating, loss of motivation. Clearly from these symptoms, workplace trauma can be debilitating. It can have a serious negative toll on your mental health and your ability to function normally, and it needs to be taken seriously. Now, this has all been very doom and gloom so far, and that is not the vibe of my channel, so let's talk about what is the solution to all this. The real solution to all of this is to have better workplaces. That would solve the root cause of the issue, to build workplaces that are trauma-informed and psychologically safe. Thankfully, there has been a lot more awareness around this lately. However, the thing about systemic change is that it is slow, and so in the meantime, I've gotten started on doing some healing on my own. One of my favorite terms in the therapy world is post-traumatic growth. This article says that post-traumatic growth is positive psychological changes experienced as a result of the struggle with trauma. So this could be positive changes in the way you view yourself or others or life overall. A toxic past job is like a toxic past ex in a lot of ways. It sucks in the moment, and the immediate aftermath also sucks, but if we reframe this whole experience as an opportunity for growth, we can use it to our advantage to improve our lives moving forward. Maybe it makes us aware of our capabilities and strengths that we didn't even know we had. I definitely came out of my work experience with more confidence in myself than I had going into it. Or maybe it opens our eyes to new opportunities and possibilities. I definitely wouldn't be where I am now if it weren't for my past work experiences, and I'm pretty happy with where I am now. So I wanted to share with you how I've been getting some post-traumatic growth for myself in the hopes that it gives you some ideas for how to get some for yourself as well. The first thing I did was I acknowledged I have work trauma in the first place. I really did not want to admit that I had workplace trauma because I was kind of ashamed. I thought it made me too sensitive or it meant that I was weak. But I just found that the longer I denied the problem, the worse it got. And I really have to give credit to Nurse John's podcast for giving me the permission to finally admit to myself that I do have trauma from work. I do find his podcast really hard to listen to because I do find it really triggering, but I still listen to every episode because hearing him share all of these outrageous stories from other healthcare workers has normalized the experience for me and has helped me to realize that so many other healthcare workers have gone through what I've gone through. And it's been so validating to realize that it's not that I couldn't hack it or that I have some sort of individual shortcoming. It's a shortcoming of the system. He also point blank calls it trauma on his podcast, which gave me a label for my own experience. And being able to define my experience as trauma did take some of the pain away. The next thing I did to heal was I talked about it. My classes for my master's were all online, and so I never saw my classmates in person. We never talked outside of class discussions on Zoom, and so I literally thought I was the only person in the world who was having such difficulties with their practicum. It wasn't until the very last month before we graduated that I did start talking to my classmates, still on Zoom, but at least outside of class discussions. And we started talking about our practicums, and I was so relieved to hear that other people were going through the exact same issues that I was with their preceptors, and that it was also hurting their confidence. I also talked about it with my therapist at the time, who also happened to be a social worker who did her practicum in a hospital back in the day, and she also told me that she had difficulties with her preceptor too. And just hearing that people have been having this issue long before I did just lifted this massive weight off of my chest. Being able to talk about what I was going through with other people who had gone through the exact same thing and to feel truly seen and heard and understood got rid of any shame that I was feeling. Brené Brown, the queen, has this really profound quote about how shame works that perfectly describes how I felt before versus after opening up about what I was going through. She says, if you put shame in a petri dish and cover it with judgment, silence, and secrecy, you've created the perfect environment for shame to grow until it makes its way into every corner and crevice of your life. If, on the other hand, you put shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, shame loses its power and begins to wither. The next thing I did to heal was an exercise that my therapist suggested to me at the time, and that was to, at the end of every practicum day, write down 3 things I did well that day, and just keep an ongoing list of your accomplishments, no matter how small. And I found that over time, as my list grew, I built up more and more evidence to prove to myself that I'm not stupid and that I am capable and competent. And honestly, this exercise was the main thing that helped me rebuild my confidence and believe in myself again. The next thing I did was I took time away. I ended up taking some unpaid sick time off when I was working at the hospital, and through just not being there and being able to hear myself think again, I was able to gain some really important perspective on the job that I was not able to see when I was actively in that environment that was causing so much distress. I was able to kind of zoom out and take a look at the big picture of my life and how this job fits into that picture. And I was able to finally see that I don't have to keep putting myself through this, because there are so many opportunities that I could possibly take that would give me much more autonomy over my life, that would feel much more fulfilling, and that would still pay my bills. I was also able to really get to the bottom of why I was so unhappy. other than the daily micro traumas. It was the fact that by being in this job that was taking up the vast majority of my time and energy, I was not able to pursue my biggest life goal. I wanted to work for myself, doing something that truly supported people's well-being, and I wanted to make these videos and take YouTube seriously. That sick leave, even though it was really just meant for me to rest, it ended up being a really defining time in my work life because it ended up being the start of me making some really big changes in my work life to be able to pursue what I really wanted to do. And that brings us to the next thing I did to heal, which was I changed my environment. I am now a therapist and I make these videos. I work from home. I have control over my time. I can take a 2-hour break in the middle of my workday to make lunch and go for a walk with my dog, and I can do work at 10 p.m. if I really wanted to. I don't have to work with anyone I don't like or who treats me like shit, and I get to work on things that I care deeply about. Now, don't get me wrong, my work life is definitely not void of problems, but the difference is that now I get to kind of choose what kind of problems I have and have more control over them rather than having no control over what problems are thrown at me. And I've never been happier. I'm also not suggesting that you must become an entrepreneur to heal your work trauma. More so that the truth is we're not going to be able to heal if we remain in the environment that caused our trauma in the first place. We need to remove ourselves. You don't deserve to be treated like this. You deserve to be treated with respect and to be appreciated at work and to have control and autonomy over your life. You deserve to be in a work environment that is supportive, not only financially, but of your mental health. So if you have been thinking for a while about changing companies or changing careers or starting your own thing, I would really encourage you to take that thought more seriously and figure out what steps you would need to take to make that happen. The next thing I did was kind of boring, and that was I prioritized my needs. I had neglected my needs for so long for the sake of survival at this job, and I really felt it. Making that decision to leave and pursue what I truly wanted to do was already a huge act of choosing myself. And then when I left, I finally had the space in my life to take care of my basic needs again. I slept and it was glorious. I went to therapy and I just allowed myself to enjoy myself again. I slowed down, I traveled, I spent time with friends and family, and I worked towards my goal. And this was one of the most important things I did for my healing because it gave me my motivation back and it gave me a sense of fulfillment that had been lacking for a really long time. And it restored my hope because this time I was working towards something that meant the world to me. And over time, as I tended to my needs that I had been ignoring, I felt myself coming back to life again. This sounds so melodramatic, but that is truly how it felt like. As I've been doing all of these things to heal, I've been gathering a lot of really valuable lessons along the way, and that has been central to my healing. Looking at any adversity as a learning opportunity just makes it hurt way less. I learned 2 very important life lessons from my work experience. Number 1, I learned firsthand the dangers, both financially and psychologically, of only relying on your day job as your one source of income. And number 2, I learned that having autonomy over my work life is a non-negotiable for my mental health. And this is actually the case for everyone. There's this theory in psychology called self-determination theory, and one part of it says that autonomy is a fundamental human need and that when we don't have it, it actually has a really detrimental impact on our well-being. I remember learning about this theory at some point in my undergrad, and at the time being like, okay, cool, memorize for the sake of passing this class and then just forget about it. But when you've actually been through an experience where you had very little autonomy, this theory just hits different. These 2 lessons led me to make the decision to pursue entrepreneurship, which is something I've been wanting to do for a really long time. And I am now the happiest and most fulfilled I've ever been in my work life. Again, it is definitely not all sunshine and rainbows, but I would much rather deal with the stress and pressure of being an entrepreneur than the stress and pressure of being an employee in a toxic workplace. That is a no-brainer. Making this leap to working for myself has been one of the best decisions I have ever made, and I wouldn't have made this leap as soon as I did had it not been for my work experiences. And so I'm really grateful I had those experiences, and I wouldn't wish for anything to have gone any differently. If you're looking for more support on your healing journey, maybe as you change your work situation, I'd recommend checking out this video next, which is how to avoid the red flags of a toxic workplace from the outset, and I hope it helps you as well. But in any case, as always, I hope you are doing well, and I will see you next time. Bye.